Welcome to the Digital Week, where we make sense of the digital economy in just 15 minutes a week. I'm Monica Bradley, your host, and with me today is Marek Kowalkiewicz.
How are you, Monica?
I'm very well, thank you, Marek. Today's topic is the government's role in the digital economy. We're seeing a lot about this at a state, federal and local level in the weeks coming up. Everyone's into digital strategies. Why is this? What are the trends in this space?
That's right, Monica. And we have worked with, just like you said, local, state and federal governments in order to understand what's happening in the digital economy and how does it influence the way governments work. And we see a number of trends in this space. It's really interesting to see that one, the government is no longer the only provider of public goods, public services.
Okay. Right.
It's changing, and it's
no longer a monopoly.
Correct. Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it. It's almost like a market of
democratizing
providers.
public good.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Point number two is we're seeing the digital economy completely ignores boundaries, state boundaries, right? So there's a lot that is happening around the world where governments that are, by definition, restricted by boundaries,
by geographic, yeah,
don't really know how to respond and react.
So the boundaryless society.
That's right.
That's the economy.
More and more of that happening. If you think about it, if Facebook were a nation, they would be the largest nation in the world right now, right?
And heaven knows where Google would be.
We have a couple of billion people who regularly, at least once a month, and more than a billion people once a day logging onto Facebook. They're basically citizens of the digital economy, right? So this is huge.
Excellent. And lastly?
And the third one is we're seeing this emergence of, I would call it permissionless innovation, or we're moving away from a situation where the government would be a gatekeeper and saying, hey, this type of innovation is allowed here, this type of innovation is not allowed here. People just completely ignore it, right? And we've seen many, many cases where global digital businesses would enter a market, would enter a state, and just offer the services despite regulation that would say otherwise. The challenge is citizens mostly support it, and so government is caught in this strange situation where they have legislation, they have regulation, but the question is, should we enforce it? Right? Do citizens want us to enforce it?
So the government no longer is the sole gatekeeper.
That's right.
The activities that happen in your jurisdiction.
So these are the three trends that we're seeing at the moment.
Okay. Yeah. So the three trends, let's recap them, are that the government is no longer the sole provider of public good.
Correct.
The government is restricted by geography, but the digital economy is boundaryless. So
That's right.
There's a lot of boundaries coming across, and government is no longer the gatekeeper.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So as we move from we talk about the digital economy, and that really moves from this economy of corporations, where we had rules and processes and bureaucracy, into the economy of people, right?
Yeah.
Because the digital is people. So tell us about the attributes or the areas that governments are enacting in this new space.
Sure, and this is also, what you already highlighted, Monica, which is, we used to think about the government as a monopoly, right?
Yes.
As the one that provides services, the one that is funding initiatives, the one that is regulating, right? The reality is, it's different, right? We have a government right now that is not the one that is funding initiatives. We have all sorts of digital services platforms where people can basically go on board and join those platforms and get their initiatives funded.
So
right?
in terms of funding, that used to be the sole domain of the government, we
Correct.
now have players like Kickstarter, GoFundMe, we have impact investment bonds, which largely are raised by private or impact investors and have a government component to them, but are not solely the provision of government.
Yeah, so wealth redistribution, the task that a government would typically have in the digital economy, and we know it's been challenging, right? We all hear about stories about very successful digital organizations that make a lot of money, are really good at what they do. They're also really good at avoiding paying taxes and so on. So that wealth redistribution, the process that governments are supposed to be doing is often being challenged by what is really happening. And so we, perhaps because of that, perhaps in parallel to that, we're seeing the emergence of those completely government-independent platforms, right?
That could almost be a whole topic in itself.
Oh yeah,
Just
absolutely.
funny because there's a whole nature of perhaps it is the big global platforms that are earning revenue and not paying taxes, but are redelivering impact or funding through other means. So because they're regulated almost by the people would regulate, is that acceptable or not acceptable, and where would they,
And you said something very important here. You said the people, right? Maybe it is the new we, the people, right? Maybe it is the next evolution of a government saying, hey, this doesn't work. We, the people, are creating those platforms now.
Now, when I was a child growing up, a long time ago, I remember that people used to say, you can't do that, the government my parents used to say, you can't do that, Monica, the government doesn't allow you to do that.
That's right.
So tell us about the role of the government as the regulator.
So it's still there, right?
There's still rules. There's a lot of legislation.
Exactly. And like I said, in some cases, the government is probably a bit more hesitant enforcing some of the rules just because, of a potential outcry of the citizens, of the public, right? Hey, we want this innovation to be happening despite what, the old legislation from 1985, 1995, whatever the date would be, is saying. But there's something else, something very, very interesting happening these days. And it comes back to that trend of borderless organizations as well. We do have the regulation that governments are providing, but on top of that, or in addition to that, we have platforms, we have service providers who are saying, hey, this is what is allowed on our platform. So you have your Facebook, the example that I just gave, with 2 billion users, saying this is the type of photos that are not allowed on our platform, right? And effectively, and it's an interesting discussion, effectively Facebook is now defining the freedom of speech or freedom of expression. Right, so maybe Australian regulations say I'm allowed to say that, but then there's a platform which tells me no, you're not allowed to say it. And if this is the platform that I'm using every day and most of my time to express my views, it's effectively restricting
It's a
my rights.
quasi-regulation.
It's a quasi-regulation. It's a quasi-government.
Interesting times. And then the government is the provider of services. So the government is the provider of public good. They are there to ensure the prosperity of humans. Let's not forget, governments are all about humans.
That's right.
I notice a number of these strategies we're seeing come from government are kind of devoid of the human aspect. Yeah. Let's get back to the basis. Why does government exist? To enable and protect the human prosperity.
That's right.
So if we look at number 3 in the list of things that government do, it's being the provider. How is that changing in the digital economy?
Again, just because digital economy is reducing so many entry barriers, it's also reducing entry barriers to delivering some of the services that used to be the domain of the governments, right? So these days, it's mostly about information services and also matchmaking services. So the government used to be the place to go to find a job, right? You would go to Centrelink, right?
Yes.
You would go to Centrelink and they would tell you, hey, apparently, right? And they would tell you, hey, here's a list of jobs, professions.
I think we used to
that
have
you
a
can apply.
jobs network that was probably called something else, but in Australia we
Right.
definitely had a federally government-funded shop front.
Right.
That was the place you went to find a job.
There's no need for it anymore.
Well,
right?
I don't think they exist anymore
That's
in
right.
a government sense.
Yeah,
Right?
so you could use any public, any private provider of such services, right? Whether it's Seek, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's something else that works in your particular,
And I guess
area.
we firstly saw that really in the linkage to private hospitals, right?
Sure.
Originally most hospitals were public good and they were provided by the government, and then private hospitals come and now privates provide.
Yeah.
So it's really is it also that the private providers are moving and adopting technologies and efficiencies and better attributes that citizens are wanting at a faster rate than a government can change, so therefore the lower the cost and it's a better service provision outside of government?
And it's an excellent way of looking at it. You could, from a government perspective, you could think about it as a beautiful playground where various service providers experiment with new services. And if something works very, very well, that's a good sign for the government to say, I like it. How about we double down on it? How about we actually do the same thing with them, right? So it's an ongoing innovation space.
So government's role moves from being the person that delivers the service to being the facilitator of the problem or the problem statement, and then the working with innovators and then doubling down on seed funding or endorsement of ways that we might solve the problem.
That's right. So it almost means that, we're moving from this discussion of, being a funder, a regulator, a provider of services toward, a government that is a partner, that's a facilitator, that's an advocate of...
advocate for the problem owners or for the citizens affected.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I like it. So we're moving in that. So give us a couple of quick examples of where we've seen some of these funder, provider, and regulator move on from one to another. You gave me a great example of when we saw the terrible tragedy of the massacres in the US recently, that there was a change where immediately a GoFundMe page came up. So whereas the government might have compensated immediately the people in the vicinity,
that's right.
We saw crowdfunders, but we also saw accommodation providers come online and through Facebook groups, matched people that had been affected by the disaster to accommodation.
I think these are all great examples, and we all know that in the US there are particular challenges regarding the Medicare system or Obamacare or however it would be called. The name could change any day, and this is where people get together and say, hey, government is failing us here. Let's find a better way. And thanks to what digital economy provides, they can get together, they can self-organize, right?
And it's not always government failing, though, Marek, is it? It's sometimes just the government moves slowly.
That's
they
right.
have by their very nature bureaucracy to go through. So therefore, the private providers or people that are independent and want to get that public good done move faster.
It's more about the perception, right? So this is what they think. The government, you're absolutely right, might actually not be failing them, and perhaps there are solutions, but sometimes it's easier to just go to a platform like that.
Moving on to the jobs of the future. If the role of government is changing, what are some of these new jobs that will be inside of government?
Shall we start with the digital president?
Or in the Commonwealth, we call them prime ministers.
Digital prime minister, right?
PM.
A digital governor.
You can PM.
Yeah.
You can DM the PM.
DM the PM. Trust analyst, someone who works for the government and analyzes all of the platforms and says, well, this is a scam, this is a legitimate request for help, and so on.
Right, and of course have loads and loads of big data behind them to do that. Okay.
Regulation analyst, someone who looks at terms and conditions of a particular service and then figures out whether they're in conflict with the local regulation and so on.
And my personal favourite, because as much as we digitise, I like to believe it's all about human prosperity when we're talking about government. So bringing some of these personal concierge face-to-face, can we give every citizen a concierge, a face-to-face concierge to navigate?
That's right.
Multiple levels of government made look easy using digital.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Okay, so what can we tweet out today? Have you got a tweet of the week for us?
God save the Queen with digital regime. I used to listen to Sex Pistols when I was a kid. So.
I have one. The digital economy, the largest change management project ever undertaken by the human race.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much. That's a wrap from us today at the Digital Week. Join us and with the conversation on Twitter @ChairDigEconomy. And we'll see you next time on the Digital Week.